How are we to understand the beast in Revelation chapter 13? I mean, really, that's it. That's what we're going to be exploring today as we get back into the text of Revelation. We've taken somewhat of a break from the book of Revelation, kind of sort of started talking about Revelation last week, but didn't dive fully into the text that we're going to be looking at now. But our last full deep dive into the text of Revelation was several weeks ago, 4 or 5 or 6 weeks ago-ish. As we ended chapter 12, now we're going to get into the text of Revelation chapter 13, where we are introduced to the beast. And I think that a lot of people kind of congregate towards a certain understanding of the beast and who or what he represents. And I'm going to be one who's going to be challenging that. Now, I'm not the only one. I'm not on an island all by myself. I mean, there are other people that fall in line with questioning whether the contemporary, most common outlook on the beast of Revelation is actually true and biblical. But we'll get into all of that. We got a lot to talk about here in these initial verses of Revelation chapter 13. So good things in store. I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right, so looking forward to getting back into the text of Revelation. I've been looking forward to it for a little while now, but it was good to have the break that we did. I think we had a good discussion in the past handful of weeks regarding faith and what faith looks like, and especially the areas where we delved into the gospel, specifically when we talked about the faith of the Roman centurion and the woman with the bleeding problem. I love delving into the Gospels. There was a period of time, probably a few years ago, where I wasn't preaching every week, but I mean, occasionally whenever the pastor needed a break or, a series of breaks or, weeks where he needed a break or if he was gone or something, I would always find myself gravitating towards the Gospels and eventually preaching something from the Gospels. And that was just because I just couldn't get enough of Jesus and, just seeing the wonder, the grace, the majesty of our Savior in the pages of Scripture. It really made me excited about preaching him more and more from the Gospels. Not to say that anything else outside of the Gospels is worthless or anything. Obviously, that's not what I'm saying. And sometimes I would have a thought of, looking at something from Paul's epistles or something like that, but I would always end up going right back to the Gospels for some reason. So there was a period of time a few years ago where, I just really found a lot of value in what I was gleaning from the Gospels and excited to preach and to share those things. So it was really a delight to be able to speak on those things, on a couple of those episodes that I did. But then last week, just kind of in introductory form, just kind of setting the table for what we're going to be getting into as we get into Revelation chapter 13. Mainly, what we talked about last time was the whole thing of tribulation saints and asking the question, do they really exist? And we concluded, or at least I concluded, maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't agree with me, that they don't exist, that the Bible doesn't leave room for the existence of tribulation saints. And so this isn't the time or the place to really go into a review of that, nor do I think it's really even necessary, really, to be quite honest. If you're curious about it and you didn't listen to the last episode, I would encourage you to listen to that. It's not necessarily a prerequisite for what we're going to be talking about here, but in case you want to get in on that discussion regarding that, it's certainly available for you to take a listen as far as all of that goes. But right now we're going to delve in, just into the initial verses of chapter 13, verses 1 through 4. Before we do that, let me just read a section here, which is going to involve the verses that we're going to look at today, and also the verses that we're going to look at next time. And next time, the next section of verses there in this one section, I don't know if we're going to take 1 or 2 weeks to look at that. Maybe a single episode will do, but who knows. But I'm going to read Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 through 10. We're only going to look at verses in depth, verses 1 through 4, but I want to read this entire section here, which involves verses 1 through 10. Okay, so starting in verse 1, it says, "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. One of his heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. And the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, 'Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?' And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. And all who dwell on earth will worship it, everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword must he be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints." Okay, so that's verses 1 through 10. But like I said, though, we're just going to look at verses 1 through 4. So getting into this chapter and delving into this chapter, we're introduced somewhat, and I say somewhat because it's technically in the order of the book of Revelation. We're not seeing the beast for the first time, but this is somewhat of an introduction to the beast. And the reason why I say somewhat, and the reason why I say this isn't the first time that we've seen the beast, is that we've seen a glimpse of him back in chapter 11. If you remember, when we were looking at that chapter, we were looking at the 2 witnesses who, if you remember our discussion from that chapter, we said represents the church in the present age. Again, I don't want to go through a full review of all of that. It would take a lot of time to do that. Just go back and listen to those episodes. But the 2 witnesses representing the church in the present age, and what we read as far as the beast is found, I believe. Let me look back here. In verse 7 of chapter 11, it says, "And when they had finished their testimony, the beast that rises from the bottomless pit will make war on them and conquer them and kill them, and their dead bodies will lie on the street of the great city that symbolically is called Sodom and Egypt." Okay, so there is just a mentioning of the beast. Okay, already in the midst of things going on as far as persecution against these 2 witnesses that we talked about before, which again I believe represents the church in the present age. But when we get to chapter 13, we're given a view of the beast as if he is being introduced for the first time. Which, again, this should show us something that I've said in previous episodes before, and that is that we're not dealing with a chronological, sequential unfolding of events in the book of Revelation that immediately precede the second coming of Christ, i.e. a 7-year tribulation period. Like I said, we were seeing different visions from different camera angles or perspectives, okay? And so in the perspective that we were looking at, as we were looking at chapter 11, we see a beast that is already on the scene. Here, when we get into chapter 13, it's as if we're being introduced to the beast for the first time, and his origin and where he's coming from and that sort of thing. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Now, this is a second person in the so-called, I guess you could say, unholy trinity. That's how I've heard this whole thing being referred to, just as far as the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. We talked about, we spent maybe like a good month before we took our break. We spent a good 4 weeks talking about Revelation chapter 12, which gives us a good look at the dragon and what we were dealing with and who we were dealing with that. And specifically what we looked at in our last study in the book of Revelation, chapter 12, verses 13 through 17, we got to look at the dragon and his pursuit, which, by the way, the dragon is Satan, is the devil. The pursuit that the dragon makes of the woman who is being protected by God. At first we see water spewing from the dragon's mouth as if to, kind of overtake the woman who is in flight. And the earth opens up and swallows up the river, the torrential river that goes after this woman. And so we talked about last time that, a lot of times when we're looking at the book of Revelation, the things that proceed from the mouth of something usually represents things that are said. And the fact that this dragon in this passage is also referred to as the serpent, that great deceiver, right, who deceives the whole world. That's what the earlier part of chapter 12 talked about. I think the impression that the first century audience and we as readers are supposed to get is that what we're dealing with in the dragon/serpent is that he tries to overtake the church and destroy the church with lies, false doctrine, and that sort of thing. But the church is protected. And so when we get to the end of chapter 12, we see this whole thing of where it says right there at the very end of verse 17, it says, and he stood on the sea, on the sand of the sea. And then you go into chapter 13, which we're going to start to look at, and we see the emergence of the beast. And one of the same things we see with the beast, and we even read it in the passage that I just read to you a couple of minutes ago, although we'll go into more detail about this next time, is that the beast is one who makes war with the saints and even conquers them and kills them. So we're talking about violence, we're talking about persecution and that sort of thing. So here we're seeing two ways that the dragon uses, that he employs to in his attempt to destroy the church. Number one is through lies, deception, false teaching. I think it would fall into all of that and so many other things. But then the other thing that you see is persecution, and trying to destroy the church through violence. And I think I mentioned this last time, and if so, I'll repeat it again here, is that let's not get the impression that the way this works is that the dragon tries to destroy the church by feeding it deception, and then when he sees that doesn't work, he says, okay, well, I'm just going to now turn to persecution, never using the tool of deception again. As if he says, okay, I'm going to drop this strategy and go to this strategy. Again, Revelation is a very interesting way to read and interpret. This isn't his way, John's way of describing and saying that, okay, he tried this and that didn't work, so he did this. I mean, just as it relates to how things connect with reality in human history. I think that the broad idea is that both of those things are in play, and the way that it's described is giving the reader and the listener a full understanding that these are the things that go on. And listen, the first century audience would totally understand this. And one of the things we're going to see, and one of the things we're gonna make known as we unfold chapter 13, is that it's very important for us to remember and to take our minds back to what we've seen and what we've read in chapters 2 and 3 regarding the 7 letters to the churches of Asia Minor, because a lot of the things that are represented in the beast, the first beast, maybe I should say, and then even with the second beast, who will be introduced to later on in chapter 13, really are reminiscent to a lot of the things that the churches of Asia Minor were already going through. Now, this is very important. Let me just take some time to just say this, because I think this is very important. And this is going to speak very much into a lot of things that we're going to try and unfold, and I would even say maybe even correct as far as misunderstandings or misinterpretations as it relates to some things in this passage. in this chapter. I mean, you can untangle things all throughout the book of Revelation as far as misinterpretations and misunderstandings. But I think chapter 13 is kind of one of those main hubs of misunderstanding and misinterpretation. I don't say that to be prideful. I could be wrong in some of these areas, but I think that there's been a lot of muck and mess as it relates to these sorts of things here. So let me tell you this one thing here that's going to be very important. It's very important that when we look at this chapter and even other things in the book of Revelation, that we look at this in a way so that we understand that what we read are things that, as far as interpretation goes, would have been totally understood by the first century audience. Okay? Let me say that again. The things that we encounter in the book of Revelation and the way that we interpret it are things that should be understood in a way that the first century audience would have understood them. And I say that because a lot of people take the things in Revelation 13 or even just in other parts of Revelation all around, and they fling it all the way to the future and give it futuristic interpretations that the first century audience would have had no concept or no understanding of what that would mean and what that would look like. And this is a book that's written specifically to them. And it's meant to reveal, okay? So this is a revelation. It's supposed to reveal things. It's supposed to make things known. So they wouldn't understand things that we would, if we just kind of peg things in a totally 21st century sort of way that had no bearing or understanding of, from anybody in the first century. That's an incorrect way of looking at this book and an incorrect way of looking at this chapter. And we'll get into this more as the deeper we go into chapter 13. But I think it's important to lay that out on the table right now so we can kind of have an understanding. We have to understand that what's laid out in Revelation, even up to this point and even beyond what we're going to beyond here where we are right now, are things that I truly believe in my heart of hearts was very much understood by the first century audience. We here in the 21st century are the lost ones, okay? Just as far as our understanding. And in a certain sense, that's understandable. A gap of culture, a gap of time, and that sort of thing. But here's one thing that contributes to this, and that's a lack of understanding of the Old Testament. If we really want to get a full understanding of what we're dealing with in Revelation and coming to a proper interpretation, you have to have an understanding of the Old Testament. And listen, when I say that, I'm not just meaning Daniel, Zechariah, and Ezekiel. I mean those Old Testament passages where we usually think of things eschatologically. And it does involve those books, and in fact, we're going to be taking a look at Daniel here in a couple of minutes. But we're talking about the Old Testament all around. Okay, and hopefully I've been able to do an effective job of showing you different Old Testament references that John is making in Revelation, which I think the first century audience had a greater understanding of the Old Testament than many Christians do today in the 21st century. So that when the book of Revelation is read to them, they say, "Oh, I know exactly what he's talking about, and I know exactly what that means, and I know exactly what he's getting at there." Okay, so I get all of this to say is that we need to be ones who conform our thoughts and our understandings and our interpretations to what the first century audience would have understood. Okay, and that's really what I'm getting at there. Okay, so having said all that, let's get into this whole thing with the beast. Now let's just lay out right there at the outset. And I think many of us know this, and many of us understand this, at least if we've been Christians for a while and we've studied Scripture and we've heard sermons and stuff on Revelation, even particularly on chapter 13. A lot of people, their understanding of the beast is an understanding of the beast as a person, and that person is somebody who is seen as a future, or to some people, a present person, because if they think that they're on the cusp of, the rapture or the second coming of Christ or something, but a future individual person called the Antichrist, and who becomes a world ruler, a world leader, who unleashes persecution on the church during the tribulation period, and even with on the people of Israel as well. which I don't really get that mixture. I know that that's an understanding that some people have. It's actually kind of a contradictory sort of notion. We don't need to go into that now. Maybe we'll get into that more next time, just so we have a greater understanding of that. But all that to say, let's just have in our minds here that in a lot of people's minds, when they think of beast or they read of beast, the beast in Revelation chapter 13, they think the future eschatological Antichrist in the future that rules as a world leader during the 7-year tribulation period. And I'm one who's going to say that I don't think that that's necessarily how we need to look at that. I mean, even you guys know my thoughts on the 7-year tribulation, but even putting that aside, I mean, I do believe that there is an end times Antichrist who's going to come on the scene. My question would be, is the end times Antichrist actually being what's depicted here in Revelation chapter 13? I'm going to challenge that notion, but let's just start to get into this here in the text itself as we look at verse 1 verse 1 of chapter 13. Now at the very tail end of chapter 12, we see that the dragon is standing on the sand of the sea. Some people have speculated, and there's good merit to this. I think that the fact that the dragon is standing on the sea, that he is, the sand of the sea might represent peoples and nations and languages and that sort of thing. We get a sense of peoples and languages and everything like that as it relates to the activity of the beast, and the activity of the beast is inspired by the dragon. We read about people, gathering against the people of God like the sand of the seashore in Revelation chapter 20. We're going to get to that as well. But whatever the case, we have the dragon there on the sand of the sea, and out of the sea is going to come this monstrosity of a beast. Okay, so as you get into verse 1, it says, "And I saw a beast rising out of the sea with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems and its horns on its horns, and blasphemous names on its heads." Okay, so there we see, just kind of this introduction, this beast that's rising out of the sea. And, it just seems like the description of a beast is appropriate given what we're going to learn about the beast, and what it represents and what it tries to do as it relates to God, Jesus Christ, and his program. Very ugly, very vicious sort of creature, just symbolically speaking, as we're seeing the picture that's painted here, in our minds, and we're getting a glimpse of what John is seeing here in his vision. Okay, so there's a beast that's rising out of the sea, and notice here, it says it has 10 horns and 7 heads. Now, understand that this is the same, in a reflective sort of way, the same thing that we see with the dragon, which gives us an understanding, I think, that what we're seeing in the beast is something that's proceeded from the dragon. And we get an even greater clue of this the further we go down in these initial verses here in Revelation chapter 13. Okay, so this really the sense that we're supposed to get here is that the activity of the beast is something that is very satanically inspired, something that is demonic in nature, and is part of, you can pretty much say, is part of that. Is part of that invisible war that we see going on in the present age. Okay, Satan doing his work behind the scenes in ways that we can't see because we're natural physical beings. But with everything going on with Satan and how he works to destroy God, Christ, and the program of Christ, we see that the beast is somebody who reflects these characteristics. If you look at chapter 12. In verse 3, it says, "And another sign appeared in heaven, behold, a red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns." Okay, so he has 7 heads and 10 horns. And so we're seeing, given a mirror image here of the beast, where it says 10 horns and 7 heads. I mean, the same number of horns and the same number of heads, but kind of just described in reverse order there. So there's that reflection there between the dragon and the beast. Okay, And it has with 10 diadems. This is chapter 13 with 10 diadems on its horns. Now this is where the difference is between the beast and the dragon. With the beast, it shows here that it has 10 diadems on its horns, and whereas with the dragon, it says on its heads 7 diadems. So there's 7 diadems on the head of the dragon, and there's 10 diadems on the 10 horns of the beast. And all of this, I mean, no matter how you look at this here, I think again the thing with the diadems is kind of something that you see as it relates to power and authority. And I would even be one who would say that this is very much expressed in a lot of ways as far as power and authority through the institution of the government or the state. And in its very different ways and in its different forms throughout human history, seeing the activity of the beast, just kind of unleashing itself, against the people of God, in human history. Okay, so that's kind of what we have going on here. So we see this sort of reflective thing going on between the dragon and the beast, and we get this sense that the beast is satanically inspired to carry out Satan's program to try and demolish the program of Christ and his people. That's ultimately what we have going on here. Now notice 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. Okay. Now this whole thing of blasphemy coming from the beast is going to be something that we're going to see a couple other times here in this passage. If you go again to verse 5, which again we're going to talk more about this next time, verses 5 and 6, it says, "And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling." So this is a very blasphemous creature that we're looking at here in John's vision. And so we're not surprised then, even as we're looking at things here in the beginning, and it says and blasphemous names on its head. So that gives you this idea. If we're talking about blasphemous names on its head, we understand that he's speaking and vilifying the things of God, the things of Christ, and saying things against God's people. So it's very clear here what we're dealing with here as it relates to the beast here. And the beast is not a good creature at all. Now, as it relates to verse 2, let's get into verse 2. Verse 2 is very interesting. And what we're going to see here in verse 2 is kind of a clincher as to why we shouldn't necessarily understand the beast to be an individual, a person who is the future Antichrist figure. Okay. Now, again, like I said, I believe that the Antichrist, that there is a future Antichrist figure who will come on the scene right before the second coming of Jesus Christ, not necessarily during a 7-year tribulation period, but there will be an Antichrist who comes on the scene right before Jesus Christ is revealed. But I don't think that we should understand the end time Antichrist to be this person here, this beast in Revelation chapter 13. Now, what does verse 2 say? Verse 2 says, "And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth." Okay, and so here's what we have here, and there's another feature here. Again, going back to verse 1, talking about the horns, that's going to be important, along with what we just saw there in verse 2. Maybe if you've done study of last things and eschatology, and even with the book of Daniel, maybe this sounds familiar to you, this description that we just saw there in verse 2. And if it sounds familiar to you, that's because you're probably recognizing what is described in Daniel chapter 7. Now let me read verse 2 of Revelation chapter 13 again, and then we're going to read Daniel chapter, not the whole chapter, but the beginning parts of Daniel chapter 7, so we can see what connections were being given here. So again, chapter 13, verse 2 says, "And the beast that I saw was like a leopard, its feet were like a bear's, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth." Okay. Now, we go to Daniel chapter 7, and I'll just start in verse 1. I'll read verses 1 through 8. That's pretty much where we see these things here. And it says, starting in verse 1 of Daniel chapter 7, it says, "In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, 'I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea. And four great beasts came out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion, and it had eagle's wings. Then as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, 'Rise, devour much flesh.' After this I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful, and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces, and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were left before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horns, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horns were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking great things." Okay, so there you see this. So hopefully you saw in the description there in Daniel just kind of where this vision is drawing from as far as Old Testament imagery is concerned. Here in Daniel chapter 7, we see these beasts, these creatures coming out of the sea. All right, and you have one that looks like a lion, and then you have another one that looks like a bear, and you have another one that looks like a leopard, and then you have one that doesn't look like any sort of creature, but it has 10 horns. And we see features of those creatures here in this description of the beast in Revelation chapter 13, verse 2. It said it was like a leopard, right? We saw that in Daniel 7. Its feet was like a bear's. We saw the bear in chapter 7 of Daniel, and its mouth was like a lion's mouth. It was a leopard, a bear, and a lion. Those 3 creatures we saw. And by the way, in Daniel 7, what it says there, it says that he saw these creatures coming out of the sea, which is what we see here. If you go back to verse 1 of Revelation chapter 13, this beast is also seen coming out of the sea. And so, the sea in Revelation a lot of times is connected to all the chaos and confusion and satanic melee, I guess you could say, that goes on, which eventually is going to be done away with when we get to the end of the story, obviously. But that's what you have there, and no wonder, because you have this kind of the same thing. Just if you understand what those creatures in Daniel 7 represent, you see that it does, and indeed out of the sea comes things that are people and kingdoms that are chaotic and violent and dismaying and that sort of thing. So in the same way, I think that's what you have here. So here in Revelation chapter 13, we see kind of a conglomeration, a composite or a conglomeration of those creatures in chapter 7 of Daniel, and they're put together to give us this composite, conglomerate sort of image of the beast, which is why this is one big reason why I don't think that you're dealing necessarily with an individual. With all of these features from these different creatures coming together, you kind of have a melding together of different kingdoms to bring forth this one beast. Okay, and the way that people usually understand the beast, if they're seeing him as an antichrist figure, is, somebody who is from Rome or of Roman descent and that sort of thing. But how is that really the case when you have these different creatures and different features of them put together in this one beast? It's not exclusively something where we should have a Roman understanding. By the way, the creatures that we saw in Daniel 7, a lot of people attribute that to the rise of Babylon. Then after Babylon, you have the Medo-Persian Empire. After that, Greece, and then after that, Rome. Okay, that's how those creatures are understood and what they represent. We don't need to go into a deep dive or detail on that. That kind of goes beyond the scope of what we're looking at here. But just understand, and with those representations, which is almost universally embraced. I mean, there's some other theories here and there as to what those creatures represent as far as kingdoms go. But the large majority of people say Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. Okay, so you have features from all of those kingdoms that are drawn from Daniel 7 being put together here in Revelation chapter 13. And I think the idea is that we're given a totally new perspective on things. With all of these things put together, we're dealing with something that's totally other, and it has a broader reach. And it doesn't represent just an individual, but it represents a wide variety of political governments, systems, ideologies, and or what have you that lays out its assaults against God, the things of God, Christ, and His people. Okay, that's really what you're dealing with here. You can also kind of get a clue on the difference in these creatures when we understand that from Daniel 7, when we're dealing with these four kingdoms, we're dealing with kingdoms that had specifically to do with their attack, their trampling, their overtaking the Israelite people, right? So that's kind of the narrow perspective that we have. When we get to Revelation chapter 13, not only do you have a composite of all of the features of these creatures, but you also have a broader outreach as it relates to this beast, because as we read later on in that passage, he's given authority over every tribe, tongue, people, and language, not just the people of Israel. Okay, so we're dealing with something that's bigger, that has a wider reach. Okay, and so in that way, we're dealing with kingdoms. And by the way, I think the way of looking at this primarily as kingdoms, it shows itself off even more when you look at Revelation chapter 17, where John is kind of given a little bit more insight as to what the horns and the heads and everything like that mean. The heads are 7 hills, and then there's 7 kings, right? The 10 horns are on the beast are 10 kings as well. So you get this idea that we're dealing with something, mostly I think coming from a political, geopolitical sort of thing, and how that relates in a negative way to the people of God, and how it goes after Christians and persecutes them and that sort of thing, just as we see later on in this passage. Okay, now there's some questions as to how loosely or how specifically to interpret these 7 heads and 10 horns in Revelation chapter 17. We won't deal with that until we get there. I don't want to get too much in the weeds now. We'll talk about that when we get to that point in chapter 17. Okay, so we'll table that and we'll set that aside for now. But I think the important thing to understand now, okay, the important thing to understand now is that we're dealing with, I guess the best way to look at it is a collection of, you can say, governments, ideologies, economic things, all of these things expressing itself in ways that attack the people of God, i.e. the church. Okay, that's the understanding that I think that we should get when we're talking about this beast, and just based on how it's described here. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. I hope I'm making that somewhat clear here. Now, as it relates to most people's understanding of the beast, as being the Antichrist figure, as in the end times Antichrist individual, I think we need to be careful here, because we have to understand that really the any mention of Antichrist, whether it's the Antichrist or an Antichrist, shows up only in four places in Scripture. All of them coming from our good friend the Apostle John here, who wrote the book of Revelation here. But I think it would be instructive, just real quickly here, to look at the usages of the term Antichrist here in these passages. It's found mainly in 1 John. There's 3 areas in 1 John where you see this, and then you see it again appear in 2 John. I don't believe the term Antichrist or any description of Antichrist as shows up in 3 John. But in 1 John chapter 2, if you were to look, for example, at verse 18, you have this. It says, "Children, it is the last hour. And as you have heard that Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. Therefore, we know that it is the last hour." Okay, and the last hour being being just a description of the time between the first and second comings of Christ. If you look in other parts of Scripture that talks about the last times or the last days, that's the sense that you get from that. And it's no different here when it's talking about the last hour. Okay, so and so here it says as again in verse 18 of 1 John chapter 2, "And as you have heard that Antichrist is coming," so we know that there is the Antichrist who is coming, and I believe that that's more in line with what we saw last time with the man of lawlessness in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Make no mistake, it says so now many Antichrists have come. So there's the mentioning there. Now, if you skip down to verse 22, listen to how this is further explained here as far as Antichrist. Verse 22, "Who is the liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, he who denies the Father and the Son." So there we have what is Antichrist. Well, number one, we know that he's a liar, and he's a liar because he denies that Jesus is the Christ. And then it proceeds to go on to say that this is the Antichrist. So an Antichrist, whether you're talking about the Antichrist in the future or an Antichrist between the first and second comings of Christ, which there are many of them in the past and even today, right, is somebody who denies that Jesus is the Christ. Okay, there's that denial there. And that's what it says. This is the Antichrist who denies the Father and the Son. Okay, and then when you go to chapter 4 of 1 John, and let's see. Let me start in verse 1. Verse 3 is where it's at, but I want to start in verse 1 and read through verse 3 here. It says, "Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard was coming and now is in the world already." Okay? So the spirit of Antichrist is already there now. And just as the one that is coming will display the same characteristics, although he's probably be on a bigger stage, I guess you could say. But what makes up this description of whether you're talking about the Antichrist or the several Antichrists is that every spirit, in verse 3, every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. Okay, that is Antichrist. Okay, flip over to 2 John and verse 7, and it's just verses because it's just one chapter. And John says, "For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist." So notice we're dealing with deception, we're dealing with lies, we're dealing with denials of who Jesus Christ is, denying him altogether or denying that he came in the flesh, which is kind of has sort of the Gnostic sort of underpinnings of that John was trying to speak against, that was kind of existing in its incipient form. So that's what you're dealing with. And that's all the references to Antichrist. And so when we read those references to Antichrist, what we're dealing with, ladies and gentlemen, is, deception that draws away from the one true God, denies Jesus Christ, denies the Father, denies that Jesus is the Christ. Okay? And whether you're talking about somebody who kind of has a kind of a private understanding of that, or somebody who declares that and tries to draw people away from that, that's really what you're dealing with. Okay, that's Antichrist, both the little small Antichrists that have been going on in human history, plus the Antichrist who's going to come in a much bigger form, right before Jesus Christ comes back. Okay, that's what we're dealing with here. So when you look at Revelation chapter 13, and we're talking about the beast and what makes up his activity, really you don't see a lot of that going on. Now you see some semblances of that, but again, the way that we see verse 2 and this conglomeration of kingdoms drawn from Daniel chapter 7 gives us an idea of the wider scope of what goes on in this anti-Jesus sort of movement in history, inspired by Satan, right? And his program against the church. And really, again, what we see in latter parts of chapter 13, at least the section that we read today, it's made up of persecution. That's really what you see as far as the beast, and it doesn't so much fit into the category of the Antichrist, I would say. And just given our understanding of verse 2, I think that you're more in line with seeing the beast as a representative of many antichrists in the world, okay? Because you do get a semblance of that, especially when we're talking about the second beast that we're going to look at eventually in chapter 13, that false prophet that's going to come on the scene later on in this chapter, and how that all mingles and works together. I mean, even with systems and political systems that are mingled with religion, false religion, and that sort of thing, you kind of see that antichrist spirit that's there. I mean, goodness, have you seen and understand what goes on in the religion of Islam, and how that even fits hand in glove with a lot of governmental systems in Islamic countries, right? And even the extension of that in persecution against Christians. And listen, they're not the only ones, but I'm just saying that as an example. There you see, this understanding of it's not the Antichrist, but it's just one out of many Antichrists that are out there. Okay, so whether you're talking about actual physical persecution, which we're going to talk about here next time, or you're talking about any sort of ideology or any sort of economic system that's designed to put the hurt on Christians, that's a possibility as well. Remember, folks, we've seen that sort of thing in some of the 7 churches of Asia Minor. The 7 churches of Asia Minor, some of them, depending on their situation or who's coming against them, have seen manifest before their eyes the spirit of Antichrist as it's described in this creature of the beast, okay? But it's not anything having to do with a future 7-year tribulation Antichrist figure. I think what you're dealing with more accurately as representatives of many kingdoms and many political systems or economic systems that are meant to destroy the church, and they are the many antichrists, because within those systems, within some of those systems that fit hand in glove, there's also this declaration that Jesus is not the Christ, and you have some people who kind of see themselves as deity. That's another thing that you saw in the Roman Empire, again, which the first century audience would have been familiar with, especially as it related to emperor worship, right? Emperors themselves setting themselves up as deified figures. That is the spirit of Antichrist. It's not the Antichrist, but it's an Antichrist. You see what I'm saying? So the beast is not a single individual, right? That that shows up only in the last part of human history before Jesus Christ comes back. Now, again, I remember, like I said, I do believe that that the Antichrist is coming at the end. But what we're dealing with here with the beast, at the very least, what you're dealing with is the many antichrists that have already come. Okay, so that's really what we're dealing with there. Wow, spent a lot of time on verse 2. It's still in the middle of verse 2. It says, and to the beast, the dragon gave its power and his throne and great authority. Now, don't let this fool you. It's not like the dragon is all in himself running the show. We've seen in different parts of Revelation up to this point how the sovereignty of God works into all of this. And I think we all know scripturally, and even from other parts of Scripture, how the devil is God's devil, right? To borrow that term. So even though it's saying that the dragon gives his authority to the beast, understand that this is not an authority in and of itself. That God is one who's still running the show. He's allowing these things to happen so that his purposes can ultimately be accomplished. Okay, but that ending part of verse 2 is going to give us some insight in these next few verses here. Okay, now that the dragon has given authority over to the beast, so the beast, in whatever form that it shows up as in human history, between the first and second comings of Christ, there's several different manifestations of this that you can see in human history, in governmental systems, in government, in particular government leaders. They are manifestations of the beast that's described here, especially when it comes to the brutality that they exercise against the people of God. But in verse 3, it says, on one of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. Okay, let's just take that for a second here. And one of the things that you can see here is that there's kind of a mimicry here on the evil side, on the evil spiritual realm, to what we see in truth as it relates to Jesus Christ. Many people, and I think rightfully so, point to this whole thing of how it says one of its heads seemed to have a wound, a mortal wound, which kind of echoes in some way what we saw of the Lamb back in Revelation chapter 5. You remember when we saw the Lamb, and it said, where John said in verse 6 of chapter 5 that he said, "I saw a lamb standing as though it had been slain." Okay, as though it had been slain. But of course, that lamb was had been slain, but it's not slain. It's not dead anymore. It's alive. It's standing up, right? But it was apparent just from the sight of the vision that this was a lamb that had been slain. It's alive, and now it's looking as if it had been slain, but it's not dead anymore. But it's alive. And in the same way, it says, but its mortal wound. And we're talking about the beast here. But on one of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but its mortal wound was healed. Okay, so in the same way that the lamb seemed to be slain, but it's standing and it's alive, so with the beast, it seemed to or appeared to have a mortal wound, but it's healed. Okay, now there are a couple of ways that a lot of people look at this whole thing, and I think that this is very much tied into something, again, that the first century audience would have understood. The first century audience would have understood this maybe in a couple of ways. There's a couple of different possibilities here. One is that when it's talking about the beast, and the beast in the first century context, they would have understood this. One of the manifestations of this beast and how it appears in the first century, especially the people in Asia Minor, would have been, this looks like Rome. It's not exclusively Rome, right? But it is, it does have Roman features to it that the first century audience would have understood. Okay, and that's by design, I think. And so this whole thing of one of its wounds being healed, some people have attributed that to after the death, or actually more accurately the suicide of Nero. And after Nero was dead, after he died, the Roman Empire just kind of crumbled, and it had this period that had a short period of chaos, and it kind of switched between emperor and emperor and emperor and emperor for like short periods of time, and the glory and the stability of the empire looked as though it had fallen after the death of Nero. But then Vespasian comes on the scene about 69-ish AD, rules for 10 years, and under his emperorship, the Roman Empire in its vitality and its stability is revived, okay, and it's brought back to life. So in one sense, after the death of Nero, you see the crumbling, or so it seems, of the Roman Empire. Then with Vespasian, just kind of the rebuilding of the stability of the Roman Empire, and it seems to be like that. Wow, that's something else. And so it's like some people look at it along those lines. Maybe, I don't tend to go that way, but I don't necessarily dismiss it totally. Maybe they're right, but I think that there's another way of looking at this, and that is the whole legend of Nero that was still somewhat alive during the time when John was writing writing the Revelation. And that is, again, after the death, the suicide of Nero, there was a legend, where some people said that Nero wasn't actually really dead, but he was outside the boundaries of the Roman Empire, and he was planning on returning to Rome. And some people said, well, yeah, he did die, but he will come back to life and come and take over the throne again. There's a legend that many people believed. And there was a mixture of feelings on that, because Nero was not beloved by everybody in the Roman Empire. He just wasn't. Some people thought he was completely crazy, which, just read about Nero, you might understand where they're coming from, although even calling somebody crazy might let them off the hook in some sense. But so you have this whole thing where you have a lot of people who hate him, but there were some people who are looking forward to his return. Okay, which might explain, if that's the case, and I kind of lean more towards that, might explain why it says there following, and it's still in verse 3, it says, but it's more, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. Okay. Now, again, we're looking at the beast in its Roman form in the way that the first century audience would have understood it. It's not confined just to Rome, but that's how the first century understands it in their context. Okay, and these different descriptions are even being added on there more to give the first century audience a little bit of an understanding of what they're dealing with as they're going through the things that they're going through. Okay, and so like I said, I think I lean more towards the whole thing of the return of Nero, or at least the legend of that a lot of people held. And you'll find out more why that is later on when we explore later parts of the chapter. And I'll refer back to this when we get to that point again. Okay, so again, I don't want to go too much deep into the weeds on certain things that I can just explain once we get there and point your attention back to what we talked about before. Okay, but whatever the case, there's this mimicry between the evil spiritual realm and what we have with Christ. And here's the thing, it's very interesting. Somebody might look at this and might hear how this is explained and say, well, it seems to me, though, that the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ is superior by far than what anybody would have believed about Nero, don't you think? Maybe, but even so, even with that thought, you come to understand just how deep of a deception this is that people of the world are embracing as it relates to the beast. We look at this and we might think there's no contest. Jesus Christ and what he did was much more superior than what the beast is displaying here. I know, but don't you see that's part of the depths of this deception here? So we're dealing with some pretty heavy-duty deception, I would say, just given what we're dealing with here. So the whole earth is marveling at this beast, and they're following the beast, okay? In verse 4 it says, and they worshiped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who can fight against him? Okay, now here again is mimicry, on the side of the evil spiritual realm, when it's compared to what we see with Christ and the followers of Christ. Okay. Now, what's of note here is that it's saying that they worship the dragon, and I don't think that what this means is that that this dragon is that people are bowing down and actually worshiping Satan. As I mean, you do have people that exist today that do that, but I'm not. But in an overall universal sense, as it relates to the people of the world who are following the beast, I don't think you're dealing with people who are falling down and bowing down to Satan himself and saying, "All hail Satan," that sort of thing. But it is a worship of the dragon, the worship of Satan in an indirect sense. Remember, because the dragon has given his authority over to the beast, the world is marveling the beast and saying, wow, this is such a great beast, and they're worshiping the beast. So in an indirect way, they're worshiping the dragon. They're worshiping the beast, but in worshiping the beast, in an indirect sense, they're worshiping the dragon, since the dragon has bestowed his authority to the beast. See how that works? All right. And so it's very interesting here, because and worship of the beast, it really doesn't, because we think of worship, we think of gathering together in a church service and singing worship songs or bowing down or getting on our knees and that sort of thing. And in some parts of the world, it might involve that, just as it relates to even people within governmental systems. But even beyond that, it doesn't necessarily have to take that form. It can, but it doesn't have to be limited to that. Okay, so, you can have people who enthusiastically embrace certain ideologies that they dispense to different people to try and discredit and destroy once and for all the belief system of Jesus Christ and what his followers say that they claim. And, they give all their allegiance to lies, mistruths, all fed by the evil spiritual realm and by Satan himself. And they're clinging to that can be seen as a form of worship, right? That's what they give their allegiance to. They give their allegiance to falsehoods. They give their allegiance to other people who speak against God, Christ, and the things of Christ. People are elevated as heroes who, in militant atheistic fashion, will say all manner of evil things against God and Christ and the things of Christ, and people hail them as heroes if they believe the same thing. The expression of the beast and the enthusiastic acceptance and embrace of that is just as much worship of the beast as if you would have somebody bowing down in a worship service. I just want to say that so that we can broaden our minds a little bit more to what things like this can look like. Okay. But you have the worship of the beast. And really it's not surprising, because if all of this has this source from the dragon, you really see, in whatever expression that the beast has, in whatever places, in whatever time in human history, in different areas of the world, whatever sort of way that you see that, you see people of unregenerate heart and mind who fall in line with that because their nature naturally goes against God and the things of God. Really, in a lot of ways, the expression of the beast and people who are unregenerate are like kindred spirits. Really, if you really think about it. And it's kind of like a John 8:44 sort of thing, except it's not dealing exclusively with unbelieving Jews, but we're talking about unregenerate people all over the place, where it says you are of your father the devil, and you desire to do your father's will. You desire to do the devil's will. Now, when Jesus said that to the unbelieving Jews, make no mistake, the Jews weren't ones who were thinking that they were going around saying, "Oh, I want to do the will of Satan." That's not how it worked. And it's the same thing here when people are saying when it's saying here that they worship the dragon. They worship the dragon because they're worshiping the beast, and their worship of the beast, again, as unregenerate people, I think the same principle from John 8:44 still applies. You want to do your father's desire. You want to do your father's will. Your father, i.e., being the devil. In this case, in this context, in chapter 13, it is the dragon. Right? And there's so much wonder and glory, at least from the eyes of the unregenerate here, as we see here at the end of verse 4 here, because it says here, what they say is, who is like the beast and who can fight against it? Now, part of that might be, the whole thing of the wounding, the wounding at the head, and it's being revived again, and that sort of thing. Some of that might go into that. But again, this is more than just Rome. It expands outward so that it includes other things, other kingdoms, other potentates, other, all sorts of other people that can be an expression of the beast in human history between the first and second comings of Jesus Christ. And what's interesting about this whole thing, and like I said, we see it here, another mimicry here. You see that in what they say, who is like the beast and who can fight against it. I just want to turn your attention to a few places, and this is mostly coming from the Old Testament, where you see the same similar words being spoken, except what it's being said is being said to the one true God. So, for example, in Exodus chapter 15, verse 11, who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glorious deeds, doing wonders, right? Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 24. Deuteronomy chapter 8. Let's see. That's not what I want to look at there. I think I'm at the wrong passage here. There's a passage in Deuteronomy, and it's not chapter 8, verse 24. There's not even 24 verses in Deuteronomy. My apologies. We'll pass by that one for now. Sorry about that, but let's go further than there. If I find the one in Deuteronomy, I'll show it to you. And there's a lot more. It's not just what I'm showing you is not just limited to these areas here. But in Psalm 35, verse 10. Psalm 35, verse 10, all my bones shall say, O Lord, who is like you, delivering the poor from him who is too strong, and from him, the poor and needy, from him who robs him, right? And then just one other place I think will be sufficient. In Isaiah chapter 44, and in verse 7, and this is God speaking here in this verse. Who is like me? Let him proclaim it. Let him declare and set it before me. So there you see the language there, just in those few examples in the Old Testament. Like I said, there's others as well. But so it's very interesting. You see that terms like that being addressed to God, or God saying that about himself. And here with the beast, the mimicking of that, at least from the people of the world who do not know God and do not have Christ, saying of the beast, who is like the beast and who can fight against it. And the whole thing of who can fight against it, again, there's an apparent invincibility here. Now, that invincibility is going to be short-lived as far as the whole concept of his existence in time. His day is coming where the beast will be destroyed, okay? So who can fight against it? We know who can fight against it, and we know that he is already victorious, and that his victory is secure, okay? But, so at the end, we'll know who the real deal is. Is it Jesus Christ or is it the beast? Obviously, we know it's Jesus Christ. Okay, we'll get into much more detail of that near the end of the book of Revelation. But there you see, I hope you can see just kind of how all of this is working out here with the beast. And how we can understand some of these things. Hopefully the connections have been made by some of the things that we've seen in the Old Testament that will kind of give us a greater understanding of what we're dealing with as it relates to the beast. Now, as far as his actual activity against the saints, we're going to get into that. We're going to get into that next time and talk a little bit about, not only what the beast does as it relates to the saints, but the call to endurance for the saints that are given in that passage. We'll get into that next time. But let me just close by saying this. Don't be intimidated by the expressions of the beast that we see in our day and in our age. And I think that there are many. You can see them if we understand what we're seeing here. Now, I'm not saying line up everything that you see or headlines or news reports and line them up with events in Scripture. I'm just talking about in a very general sense with what we've been given in a generalized sort of view here and what we're supposed to understand about what the beast is. You can see manifestations of the beast in our world today, in our own society, as well as in other places of the world. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about some of those things at a later time. But it might not be necessary. You can look at what's going on in our world today. You can see the manifestations of the beast and the assaults and the attacks against Christianity. Now, one of the big ways that assault it manifests itself is through physical persecution. And I think that that's what we get into next time. But even when if we're talking about that, or if we're talking about a manifestation through other means, we know, and this is the message that's laid out all throughout Revelation. We know who the winner is. If you've been with us through our study of the book of Revelation, and you might remember way back in the beginning, which was almost a year ago, folks. It's hard to believe. We started this in December, in the middle of December of last year. Wow. But in the beginning, in that time, remember what we said? We said the message in Revelation is that Jesus Christ wins. So you have this intimidating looking beast that comes out. And again, we understand that there are many manifestations of the beast that, politically, governmentally, economically, ideologically, all those sorts of things that express themselves and manifest themselves that are clearly anti-God, anti-Christ in the general form, not the Antichrist, as in the individual figure. We see all those around us, and it's important for us to know if we understand that Jesus Christ wins, then there's no need for us to be intimidated because we're already on the winning side. What happens to us on this side of eternity really is of no consequence. Now, it doesn't mean it's not hard, and it's not to say that it's going to be harder as time goes. It's not going to be harder as time goes down the road. I think it will be, but the instruction that's given to us, and again, we'll talk about this later. But in verse 10, here is a call for the endurance and faith of the saints. That is not just relegated to people of the far future. Those are words that are for us today. Okay? But never forget, friends, that you are on the winning side. Okay? And this beast that's rearing its ugly head here in Revelation chapter 13. I mean, if you're familiar with chapter 13, you know what happens to the beast, right? He's thoroughly and completely defeated. Okay? By Jesus Christ, who we are of. And because we are of him and we are in him, we can be assured that we are on the winning side. Even though in later parts of this, where it looks like we are the losers, we're actually the winners. That's kind of the language that we kind of go back on when we were talking about the church in Smyrna. Right? So have that in your thoughts and in your minds as you kind of process what we've looked at now, what we're going to look at in the next 2 or 3 weeks as we continue to study in Revelation, and specifically here in chapter 13. Okay? So we'll leave it there for now. I hope that brings clarity. I always hope that this brings clarity and not more confusion. I hope. So pray about it, though. Continue to examine Scripture and do it prayerfully, and allow the Holy Spirit to illumine your hearts and your minds to what Scripture is actually saying. And I think, and hopefully that will help along in the process as well. Okay, so we'll leave it there for now. If you enjoy this show and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts. You can also do so on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and YouTube. You can also follow me, Steve Gill, on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSERIPTS. which stands for loving the scriptures. All right, so we've delved into this. You see what we're in for, and so we're in for some other interesting things as well. Please come back. We're going to see how all of this fits together, what this has to do with you and me, and how it points to the greatness of our God. Okay, so I would invite you to come back come back for more examination of this in Revelation chapter 13. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.